Good afternoon. Welcome to the Student Affairs Staff Training and Development. I would like to introduce myself. I am Lisa Sylvester. I'm going to be hosting the training and development session for you today. And I wanted to welcome you to Anytown University. It's an exciting time. We're expanding, we're growing, and there's lots to be said and lots to do within the student affairs profession. So as we move through today's session, we're going to talk about the history of student affairs. How did student affairs come about? What was the progression? What are we seeing? What are trends from history to today? We'll talk about amendments that are going on as far as students' rights and what do students like to fight for? What are the big hot topics on campus? We'll discuss some federal laws and regulations that student affairs professionals are required to abide by and in order to help provide services for students. In addition, we'll talk about areas of discrimination that we're seeing on campus, diversity and then increasement of diversity on campus, and we'll finish with the expectations of the student affairs professional. So student affairs actually started at the end of the 19th century and it grew significantly through the 20th century. So the profession of student affairs actually grew out of necessity rather than evidence-based research. In early higher education, higher education campuses in the United States was actually, their model was based off of the Oxbridge model of education. So a majority of the early institutions in the United States were actually residential, and the tutors lived in the halls with the students. So these tutors were the beginning, the foot in the door per se, or if you will, the foot in the door for the student affairs professionals in the United States. Typically, these tutors served as the dean of discipline, and they were disciplining in place of the parents. So fast forward to the late 19th century, and in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as the number of land-grant institutions increased, so did enrollment. Enrollment of student enrollment became so increased that the university leaders could not handle all of the additional duties that were coming with providing services for students. So with these changes, it did become apparent that the additional staff members were needed, which then allowed for the president to handle most specifically the financial and faculty recruitment issues, while the student affairs professionals were able to focus on the needs and the development of the students. So the amendment rights that we're seeing that students fight for, or that we're seeing a lot on campus, are the First, Second, and Fifth Amendments. The First Amendment typically is associated with freedom of speech and freedom to assemble, but it's actually the First Amendment to the United States Constitution is actually part of the Bill of Rights that expressly prohibits the United States Congress from making any laws prohibiting the free exercise of religion, infringing on freedom of speech, infringing on freedom of press, or limiting the right to peaceably assemble. So additionally, these protections also fall under the 14th Amendment as well. And so what we're seeing on campus is students want to exercise their freedom of speech and don't always understand what that amendment right entails or what they're allowed to say under the constraints of that freedom. And what we also see is that students want to assemble. They want to peaceably assemble. So there are some limits with what that First Amendment provides for students. So first of all, freedom of speech does not mean that you can say, or that a person can say anything that they want. So some examples of this are like hate speech, right? You're not going to harass another person and then under that guise of freedom of speech say I can say whatever I want, because now you're infringing upon the rights of another person. As far as the rights to assemble, you have the right to assemble, to peaceably assemble, but you do not have the right to disrupt. And so that's where there's a fine line. What we're seeing on campuses now are that campuses are starting to set up a free speech zone. So in these free speech zones, these are the areas where, okay, this is where you can assemble, because this is where we're not going to disrupt the rest of the student body or disrupt the daily activities of education. This is where we know that you can go to this free speech zone and you're going to have the right to maybe express more in that area than what would be typically allowed in that normal education setting. Now, the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. This amendment, the right to bear arms, what we're using, or what is kind of the premise for the decision on the right to bear arms and whether or not we can have students and faculty, for that matter, bearing arms on campus, is actually the case of District of Columbia versus Heller. So that case actually does define the current constitutional understanding of the Second Amendment, and that Second Amendment protects the right of an individual to possess a firearm and to use that arm for traditionally lawful purposes such as self-defense within the home. All right, so that's kind of a gray area as far as what is happening on campus. You can think, well, if the students live on campus and that's their home, they should have the right to bear arms. And so also with that, currently what is happening, or what we're seeing, is most states are allowing for colleges and universities to decide and write our own policies regarding that right to bear arms, because this right is also limited. So for example, if the university has a daycare center and the daycare center has small children, which you would expect, if the parents of those children are going through a divorce or some kind of dispute, but we have the ability to bear arms onto the campus, we are now opening the campus up for parental dispute regarding that separate issue. So this is a policy that's still in the working, and it is university and college dependent. The final amendment we're going to talk about today is the Fifth Amendment, and that's the right to due process. So the right to due process actually refers to the idea that the governmental authorities must provide fair and unbiased and equitable procedures for determining a person's guilt or innocence, but that same principle does apply to judicial hearings on college campuses. So students have a right to present their case in campus hearings, such as when being accused of an honor code violation, prior to the judgment of that hearing. So students have a right to defend themselves. All right, so we're going to talk about now some state and federal regulations. The big ones that we're seeing too that we're kind of coming in line with are the Americans with Disability Act and the Jean Cleary Disclosure, or the Cleary Act. So the ADA, nearly all colleges and universities are subject to ADA or Section 504 or both. And what we're seeing are Americans with disabilities that are requiring more services, and more services as far as their education is concerned. So maybe increased time testing, increased time for assignments. And within that act, the university and the teachers are required to be able to provide these services to these students who are identified as having a disability, so that they can be successful, and they can be successful with these with their specific set of additional support. The next one is the Cleary Act, or the Jean Cleary Disclosure, and the Cleary Act actually requires colleges and universities that receive federal funding to disseminate a public annual security report to employees and students every October 1st. So this report must include statistics of the campus crime from the past 3 calendar years, to include details about efforts taken to improve campus safety. So we want to make sure that our students and our faculty and our staff are safe. So the annual report also includes policy statements regarding, but not limited to, the crime reporting, campus facility security and access, law enforcement authority, incidents of drug and alcohol use and abuse, and even the prevention and response of sexual assault, domestic, dating violence, and stalking. Some areas of discrimination that we're seeing on campus, or that we're trying to combat, are gender discrimination under Title IX, race and religious and sexual orientation discrimination. So Title IX of the Education Amendments Act in 1972 was a civil rights law that strictly prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in education programs and activities. So we have to include all of the sexes. All public and private elementary schools, school districts, colleges, and universities receiving any financial funds must comply with the Title IX laws. Additionally, under the Title IX, discrimination on the basis of sex can include sexual harassment, sexual violence, rape, assault, sexual battery, and sexual coercion. Under the federal law, moving on to race, race discrimination in education is also prohibited. It's prohibited under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act law. So Title VI protects people from discrimination based off race, color, national origin, and religion. All right, so this is for any institution that, again, receives any federal financial assistance. So now we're going to talk about diversity and some aspects of diversity that we're seeing. First is equity, and I want to drive to the point the fact that equity does not mean equal. All right, so equity is not to be confused with equality. Not all students are coming from the same background, so many considerations have to be made to ensure that the success of all of our students is met. We want to make sure that we're providing what is needed for all of our students and that their needs are going to differ, and understand that their needs differ based on the areas such as potentially socioeconomic status, secondary education institution they attended, maybe their family education background, and disabilities. These are some of the considerations that we need to account for to ensure student success. We also want to look at fair access or access. So we need to provide fair access to our educational institution, and in some ways we can achieve this by recruiting in all districts of a particular area, especially in districts without great access to technology. So this could mean in-person visits to the school rather than emailed flyers, or to schools with better technology support. And then finally, inclusion, ensuring that we're including all students and providing opportunity for all students regardless of gender, race, national origin, sexual background, religion, regardless of anything, regardless of intelligence, aptitude, or disability. We want to make sure that we're including all of our students and that all of our students feel welcomed. Some expectations of our student affairs. So our student affairs is going to keep our university president and board of student affairs abridged of matters, or understanding and aware of all the matters. Of course, we want to make sure that we're in compliance with the state and federal laws and regulations. We talked about that before. But really, we want to promote student-centered campus environment. And so student affairs is a network of services that support systems for students at the higher education institutions. So we're going to deal mainly with what happens outside the classroom. So at Anytown University, student affairs consist of student learning support, student life, health and wellness, housing and resident life, and the career center. So what are we going to help our students, how are we going to help them maintain or obtain a career? So those are the staples that you've probably always known existed at the colleges and universities, but perhaps didn't really realize fit into that one category of the student affairs or the student affairs functions. So these departments, or these sub-departments, give students a place to live. They give them access to psychologists and to support. Give them access to support with finding jobs, to tutoring, mentorship, orientation, and so much more. So like every other department in the university, we do support academic excellence, but we support academic excellence for all of our students. For further information, you can that can be found on the Anytown University Student Affairs Employees Handbook. Here are a list of the references, and I wanted to say thank you for being here with us today, and I'm excited about our future together.